Here's some basic instructions on how to set an emerald-shaped stone in a tapered bezel. Before we begin, setting emerald-shaped stones are a challenging shape to master. It takes practice. I highly recommend that you take a workshop or take advantage of some of the many technical resources that AutoFry has available. With that out of the way, let's go through the basic steps. First, check out the YouTube video that AutoFry did on how to make fancy-shaped tapered bezels. Once you have your bezel made and you know that it's the right size, you need to attach it to your jewelry object and make sure that all soldering is completed before any setting begins. After soldering, pickling, and rinsing with water, polish your jewelry object completely. Now it's time to grind the seat to hold your stone. On the long side of the bezel, you're going to want to grind a seat that's about the distance between the table to the girdle. To do this, you're going to need to use a setting burr that's about 1/4 to 1/3 of the size of your stone. You want to do whatever you have to do to grind a seat that is straight and even. This is probably going to mean using a flex shaft or a micromotor at a fairly low speed. A higher speed is going to mean diminished control. Now, using a tiny ball burr, you're going to grind out a space for the corners to lay. In this case, I'm using a 1/2 millimeter size ball burr. Here's what the finished seat should look like. Now that you have a straight and level seat, put the stone in place and put a worm of wax over the short side to the short side of the rectangle. That's going to hold the stone in place while you set it. There's lots of ways to push the bezel over the stone. For this stage, I prefer a bezel rocker, or it's also sometimes called a bezel roller. The goal is to press the two opposing long sides of the rectangle towards each other to hold the stone in place so it doesn't rock around and it's basically temporarily set. Now do the same thing on the short side of the rectangle. Push the bezel over until it touches the stone. The next step isn't, well, completely straightforward in that you need to sculpt the bezel with a hammer and a punch or a hammer handpiece over the stone. Whichever method you use, make sure you use a very light touch because it's extremely easy to forge out the metal to where it's way too thin. Just like with a regular cabochon bezel, the goal is to get metal to cover every area of the perimeter of the stone. The corners are the most challenging part because on that part of the bezel, the metal has to both stretch and compress in on itself. Once you get the bezel sculpted around the stone, you want to fine-tune it using a burnisher that is the same kind of burnisher that you'd use for flush setting, and maybe a graver. You just need to be patient and persistent. After that, clean it up with light strokes of a file. Then move on to light touches of a fine abrasive media like pumice and silicone. Give it a final polish and you are done. I hope you enjoyed this very quick synopsis on how to set an emerald-shaped stone in a tapered bezel. Again, this takes a lot of practice to master, but we're showing you the basic steps.